Greetings. Glad that you can be with me. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, as well as the West Mineral Church in West Mineral, Kansas. And today we're going to be looking at a sermon about the life of Joseph from the Old Testament. Joseph, as many of you know, had a coat of many colors, and his brothers were jealous, so they sold him into slavery to Egypt. And so when he went to Egypt, he became a slave for a man named Potiphar. Things didn't work out there very well, and he ended up in prison for several years. Then eventually got out of prison when Pharaoh had a dream, and he revealed to him, and through that dream, that there'd be 7 good years and 7 lean years, 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh said, what am I supposed to do now? And he said, well, store up grain during the 7 good years so that when the 7 years of drought come, you'll have food. And Pharaoh said, we need somebody that knows how to take care of these things. So he promoted Joseph to be an overseer in Egypt to oversee the putting away of the grain. Well, it just so happens that Joseph's brothers are back, and his family are back in the land of Canaan, and this drought hits. They're thinking like the 2nd year of the drought, and they run out of food. So they go to Egypt looking for food, not realizing that Joseph, who they sold into slavery, is now in charge of distributing the food, and they were the ones that sent Joseph into slavery. And first they go and meet with him, but they don't realize it's Joseph. He looks different. It's been several years since they have seen each other, and Egyptians have a tendency to dress different than the Hebrews did, and so they had no way of knowing that this was Joseph that they were meeting with. And Joseph finally, after a period of time dealing with them, finally reveals to them who he is. And that's where we come to in our passage today in Genesis 45, verses 4 to 9. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there'll not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of the entire household, the ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord over all of Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay." May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. When I was growing up, I had an uncle that was in the Air Force. And he and my aunt had 3 boys, my cousins, the oldest one was about 2 years younger than me. And they were stationed in lots of different places over the world. They were, for a time, they spent in Japan, and then there was also some time that they were in Hawaii. But a lot of times they would be gone for like 3 years at a time. 3 years in Japan, 3 years in Hawaii. And so they didn't come back home all that often, which my grandmother missed her daughter and her grandchildren that were gone. And so when they did come back, it was a great reunion. Everybody in the family would come, and we'd be celebrating. We'd have a good time together, because they had been gone for those long 3 years that we hadn't seen them. Now, they hadn't seen each other. We hadn't seen them for 3 years, and we thought that was a long time. And here, if we look at this story, we find out that it's been 22 years from the time that Joseph was sold into slavery to when he meets with his brothers again. They haven't seen each other for 22 years. And to say Joseph's brothers were surprised is an understatement. They didn't know. Joseph was 17 years old when he was taken, and he's now much older, now about 39 years old. He's an Egyptian official. And he accused them first of stealing from them. And you have to read the story and find out that some of the things that went on. They sent grain back, and they had things put in their sacks to make it seem like it. Anyway, it's a interesting story if you care to ever go and read it in the book of Genesis. But finally, he tells them, and he's probably been, at this time, most of it's all been done through an interpreter. He hasn't been speaking to them in Hebrew, even though he knows when they're talking to one another. He understands what they've been saying, but they don't know. They don't speak Egyptian. And he doesn't let on for a while. And finally says to them in Hebrew, I am Joseph. And they're like, this guy understands Hebrew? Well, they didn't know it was him. And yet now it's come. And he says, is my father still living? His father, Jacob, he wants to know how he's doing. He hasn't seen his father for 22 years. And yet, what's going through the minds of his brothers right now? They're the ones that sold him into slavery. This guy's the head. He can have them put in prison. He can turn them into slaves. He could even have them killed for what they'd done. Wow. It says his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified. I can imagine that they were afraid of what he might do. But we read later, and the story goes on in chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. It says, then his brothers also wept and fell down before him, and they said, here are your slaves. They were willing to become his slaves. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in place of God? Even though you intended to do me harm, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. Joseph, instead of getting mad at them, he says, God put this all into place. God is the one that orchestrated this whole thing. Wow. I remember one time when I was at a minister's meeting in Topeka, and my old English teacher was there. He was no longer a teacher. He was now a minister. And I just happened to be there, and I knew who he was. I hadn't seen him for maybe 15 years or so. And, he had numerous students throughout the years. But I went up to him. I said, do you remember me? Why would he remember me? I was not an outstanding student by any means, especially in English. And he looked, he said, let me look at your eyes. And he looked me in the eye and he goes, yeah, I remember you. Really? Huh, how about that? But Joseph told him that he was one. He said, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. That God took something that was not a good thing, it seemed like at the time, and turned it into something good. It reminds me of a passage found in the book of Romans, Romans 8:28. It says, we know that in all things God works for the good, for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. It doesn't say that all things are good, but God can make things good. God works for the good for those who love him. That God can take our negative things sometimes that happen in our lives and turn them into something good. We see that happen sometimes when a disaster takes place. Yes, the disaster is a terrible thing, but good comes out of that sometimes in how people help each other, show love for one another. Maybe something gets destroyed, but something better is built back in its place. And we've seen that happen in Parsons and in Joplin and other places. So no, the initial thing may not have been good, but good comes out of it in the long run. I remember I lost my job one time, a job I'd had for 5 years. And I'd been taking some seminary classes part-time, and it was probably going to take me another 5 years at the rate I was going to ever finish seminary. And I lost my job and had to decide, okay, what do I do now? And instead of getting another job, I went ahead and went to seminary full-time, finished up, started pastoring a church while I was in seminary, and the rest is, as they say, history. Had I not lost that job, would I have finished seminary? Who knows? But see, part of it is how things work out. So after the initial shock is over, Joseph invites them to come go home and bring back their father and move in and come to Egypt and live in the land of Goshen. Right? Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan and bring your father and your families back to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." So here, Goshen was a very fertile area along the Nile River. They were given a great place to live, and a place that might not be affected by the drought. Wow. We kind of see these themes over and over again in the Bible, where there is grace and redemption and mercy. We see in the story of Adam and Eve that God could have just said, "I'm done with you," but God gave them a chance, even though they did what they weren't supposed to do. He let them live. We see the story of Noah and the ark, where God preserves a few people as they restart a new life in the land. And Moses will later come and free the people from Egypt. Of course, we know that they don't stay. They start out as being living in the land, but they eventually become slaves. And Moses comes and brings them back and takes them back to the promised land. We see that, and we also see that in the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That out of something bad, something good came, because out of that we have our salvation. And if we look at the whole story of Joseph, in a way he is a Christ figure. In a way he did die to his old life, but then had new life, and then he also used that to save his people from their sins. We also see this in the story of Peter, who denied Jesus and later is given a chance to redeem himself and becomes a leader in the early church. So we see this again and again and again. Now, just as Jesus revealed himself to the disciples after 3 days after the resurrection, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. So in a way, another resurrection story. Jesus came into the world to save us of our sins. Joseph was sent to Egypt so that he could save his people from starvation and famine. Jesus said, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places, and I go to prepare a place for you, so that where I am, there will you be also." Joseph brought the people to the land so that they could have a place to live. Now, did Joseph's brothers deserve to get this? Did they deserve to be able to have this opportunity to survive? No, they didn't deserve it at all. In fact, they deserved to probably be slaves, just like they said. But Joseph allows them to, by God's grace and God's mercy. And do we deserve to get what God has in store for us? Do we deserve to have a place prepared for us in heaven by Jesus? Of course not. We don't deserve it. We haven't done anything to earn it, and yet we have it because of God's grace and God's mercy. And one day we're told that there'll be a new heaven and a new earth, and that we'll have that dwelling, and we'll have a new body. All these be by God's grace, God's mercy for us. in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us so that we might have our salvation through him. For us, the promised land is waiting for us, just as the promised land would eventually be awaiting them as they went to the promised land. God has a promised land for us as well, called the land of Goshen, kind of a symbolic type thing. As believers in Jesus Christ, we'll have that eternal dwelling. For that we can be glad. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope that this may have been a blessing to you, and we know that God goes with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.